people are frequently asking what got me into cryptography. And this very moment is a perfect example because it came from an anticipation 50 years ago of a world dominated by telecommunications. My late wife remembers that in summer of 1973, I told her that by the turn of the century or something, lots of people would be in important, intimate, long-term relationships with people they never met. And she's recounted this on an RSA video and said, I didn't believe him, but I ran off with him anyway. I like to say for 50 years, we've been moving toward a world in which personal interaction is going primarily and is now primarily mediated by remote communications. So you might ask 50 years, why not 150? After all, telephone's 150 years old. And the answer, maybe some of this is true. If you think about making this prediction 1870, well, sort of true that over the next 100 years, no doubt there were a lot of people, purchase agents and people like that who would at one time have written to people they were working with or gone to visit them, and who through early 20th century dealt entirely by telephone with their suppliers or the people to which they were suppliers. But telephone didn't really have the right characteristics to support all of what we do now. It was low bandwidth, but that wasn't inherent. It would have, optical fiber and other such things would have brought the bandwidth up with time. It was one-to-one, not much by way of conference calls, but that also was beginning to be fixed by the time that circuit switch telephones went into decline. The thing that's inherent in telephony is the high setup cost. So old format was sort of, you paid whatever it was and you got a 3-minute call as the basic thing. And, in my youth, it was still true that you made a call across the country and you pretty much got switches setting up a long piece of wire over which you were talking. So you have one setup and you've spent a lot on the setup. So now you really are there to support a substantial call. Now, what we do now works quite differently. And the key point is that when you go to a website and you click on a button, it turns around and hands you off to another website. And that could happen, just constantly. So you could never afford the setup costs. You could write down a protocol that did all that by telephone, but it simply wouldn't work because the delays and other costs of the calls would be too high. So the internet, of which we speak so much now, starts out with something called ARPANET, US military experiment in the 1970s. That was the first application of packet switching, sending things in little chunks rather than kind of a bit at a time or a little continuous wave. And that starts in the 1970s. And by the 1980s, it was spreading rapidly, and the term still had its literal meaning. The internet was the internetwork, the network of networks. And the ubiquity of the term internet, the ambition that currently characterizes the internet, and the legal status that made it basically a platform for international business dates from about 1990. So someday we're going to have another round of this. And right now we lack touch. We have good video, we have good sound, we lack touch, we lack smell. We're not at all close to the Star Trek holodeck. And I think there's a good chance, I think that'll happen within the century, and there's a very good chance it'll happen not by the techniques they imagine, but by direct connection into the nervous system. Networking all of a sudden, It advanced 50 years and 50 years, and maybe it's advanced another 50 years in the last 5 months, because the result of the pandemic has been that as many of us as can are doing everything we can remotely. And, I happen to like that. But if you're enjoying it, I caution you, you should look at E.M. Foster's story, The Machine Stops, which was written in 1909. And he imagined a world just of that kind. Everybody lived in a little compartment and communicated with other people remotely. One day it didn't work anymore. I think the current situation is not transient. I think it's like to alleviate off and on, and probably will do it for the first time within a few months. But two things have happened. One is that we've discovered so much of the virtues of face-to-face communications. So the first time I attended a remote meeting of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, I thought, we've lost the intimacy we had, in which we sort of held Chatham House rules meetings and people spoke very openly. But we have gained an incredible amount because we had a speaker from Romania, and we could only afford one or two of those a year when we had to pay for them to fly to Stanford. And then I talked to Bob Gaskins, who developed PowerPoint, and he mentioned that his wife, who's an Egyptologist, was my late wife's teacher, was attending seminars all over the world by Zoom. And I thought, the gain is overall greater than the loss. This isn't going to go away. I'm afraid I don't think the problems are going to go away either. I think COVID-19 I don't believe it's a biological attack, but I think it's the greatest event in biowarfare ever, because it has shown people that different societies respond differently to a pandemic, and there are things you can do to make yourself less vulnerable. So whereas the military for a long time had been worried about the contagiousness of diseases and was interested in things like anthrax that weren't very contagious, now people have seen that a very contagious disease may very well be a useful military tool. I take a grandiose view of things. I think sort of in terms of the US Revolutionary War. And at that time, the privacy of conversation was fundamental. If the king had wanted to know Washington's conversations with Jefferson or Madison or Adams, unless he could turn one of them, they could step outside, have a private conversation. The king just had no hope. There was no correspondent to SIGINT in the world today. And basically, if you now look into a pure telecommunications world in which you have this tremendous vulnerability of any conversation, I think you see a sharp dichotomy. And the one side of the dichotomy is responsibility for your actions. Because I don't think you can't have any society without people being held responsible for their actions. And a lot of the failure of internet society is like that. People sending, awful emails and things like that because there isn't an accountability mechanism. But on the other hand, if you look at the other side, very often society would like to take your control completely out of your hands. And I think there's a qualitative difference between a court saying to me, either you tell us what we want to know, or you're going to spend a few months in prison, or saying to me, okay, tell us, don't tell us, we can just take it from you. You have no control over it. And so I think that is what is necessary. The fact that you have the power to control things about your life, and you can be punished for doing it. But nonetheless, you have that choice to make. That is essential in having what we have been calling a free society. Now, the security question here Now, is how do you protect information that isn't under your control without basically having to hand it to people and trust them? And no question, as society is drawn closer and closer together by telecommunication, the number of cases in which you have to trust other people is just vastly magnified. But when it's really important not to, cryptography seems to be the only tool that's of any use. So what cryptography is an interesting thing. It's an amplifier. I have a little tiny secret. We call it a cryptographic key. And a cryptographic system amplifies that secret so that my little one, a few hundred bits, right, the security or insecurity of my little secret becomes the security or insecurity of a gigabyte, a terabyte, in some cases, maybe a whole day's traffic on the internet, something of that kind. And it is engineering this amplifier that has been the classic study of cryptography. Now, there's an important distinction, and I'm going to use the economist term, which is rests versus flows. So data occurs in two kinds of things. If you're thinking about storage, then cryptography provides you a very straightforward solution. You take something, you encrypt it, you remember the key, and you send it off somewhere, on a tape, to the cloud, whatever. If you've encrypted it properly, it's going to be safe. Maybe not from being lost, but from being understood by other people if that's not what you wanted. But what do you do for conversations? And this, in some sense, was the essential problem that I faced when I went into this field. The traditional solution to this are called key management systems. Well, they're still called key management systems, but they work a bit differently. But the classic ones had at their heart what was called the central facility, a facility that actually produced the keys. And it, in modern times, basically was full of hardware, random number generators. It produced gigabytes of key, gigabytes of random information, packaged them up, shipped them out in various ways, at first entirely physically, later lots of it electronically. And it gets staged in various places. So in the US, it gets staged, the military have staging areas that are called ComSec accounts. And then when cryptographic key is needed, it gets loaded into individual devices and gets used. And in that process, if you think about an individual user, that user is forced to trust a vast array of people and machinery. And that works just fine for something like the US military. It's a very large organization, but it's very centralized, and everybody knows the chain of command. And that allows the military to appoint NSA as what's called the executive agent for communication security. And in particular, they run the central facility. They control all of the keys, and everybody in the US military trusts them. But if you think about worldwide electronic commerce, this just plain isn't a practical idea. So you have to see that key management reflects the organizations that practice it, but it also affects the organizations. And so having a centralized key management structure of the kind I've been describing limits what an organization can do. And in particular, no organization of that kind could possibly be set up to govern all of worldwide communications, because simply the trust is not there. The world is made up of 192 countries, thousands of regions, thousands of regulatory systems, thousands of sets of standards, thousands of or millions of companies, billions of people. The diversity is tremendous. So one part of the solution was what's called public key cryptography. Whereas in classical cryptography, you and I are communicating securely because we have one key and we both know it and nobody else knows it, and that's hunky-dory. The question, of course, there is how we got it, and we got it because the key management system gave it to us, or in very small cases, because we got together and agreed on it. Public key cryptography, a major change by allowing you to break keying material into public and private pieces. So I have something public. I start out by making up something secret. And from that, I derive something public. And the thing is public sometimes is a key as such, and sometimes it isn't. It's just used to manufacture a key. But I take the public thing, and in effect, I give it to other people. It might be as broad as putting it in the phone book, or it might be closer and only given to a few people. But basically, the private key in the best possible system would be manufactured inside my own computer, my own cryptographic device, and would never travel anywhere. It would be secured by staying home. The public elements will then be passed around in one way or another and made available to all of the people who need them. That gives rise to two processes. The first one is called key negotiation. I'm trying to communicate with you publicly. It's really a little bit like bridge bidding, right? I'm south, you're north. Each of us knows, I know the south hand, you know the north hand. East and west don't even know either one of those hands. So as we make our bids, we understand a little bit more in the conversation. We're talking a little bit better to each other than we're talking to them. And if you actually used cryptographic techniques, and somebody at NSA wrote a paper called Cryptographic Techniques in Bridge Bidding, you could make use of these techniques to have perfect bidding, but that's against the rules. It was even, I think, before cryptography intruded on the matter. But all right, you and I can negotiate publicly in a room full of observers, and at the end of the negotiation, you and I will know a secret key in common that we can use for our communications, and all of the observers won't know anything about it. And that's sort of what TLS, the basic network communication security system, does. The other thing you get out of this is what's called digital signatures. And so I send you a message, and I can transform it in a way that only I can do, because it depends on secret keying material that only I have. But because you have certain public information, you can verify my signature on this document. And in particular, this makes use of what are called digital certificates, which are digital signatures applied to cryptographic keys. So you want my key? All right, you go somewhere and get it. How do you know it was the right one? Well, somebody you trust signed it. And so we have a structure of certifying authorities, and you can tell you received a correct key because it was signed by one of the certifying authorities. So in principle, the machinery is here to give us secure communication among large numbers of people. How does it work? Well, there's a problem of scale in cryptography that's been understood for just about 150 years. August Kirchhoff, who is very important, incidentally, in international languages, I think, and some other things, but Kirchhoff saw that there's a big difference between a cryptographic system meant to secure the communications of a small number of people, and a cryptographic system meant to secure the communications of, say, a whole army. And we face a similar sort of scaling problem today in what we are doing. We are talking about, incidentally, about just use of cryptography on a vastly greater scale than has ever existed in the past. When the military bought a lot of things, bought a lot of something, there were fewer than 1 million of them. There was something called the STU-3 secure telephone, was the first public key system, I think, that the U.S. fielded, and it was, I believe, went operational in fall of 1987. Total, they bought about 350,000 of them. TLS, transport layer security, is in every browser. There are billions of them. And several other things are competitive. Various kinds of smart cards and things like that use cryptography, and there are millions and millions of those things. So the scale has been pumped way up, and as a result, right, well, things work. If you're tolerant of the fact that when they're, somebody once said, New York is a place where 1 in 1 million things happen to 8 people a day, right? And you jack things up into the billions, even if things are unlikely, you get failures. Sometimes you don't consider that tolerable. So we're very critical of our systems. But the crypto-mathematical part of it seems to have been rather well solved. So, but why has this been so hard? And it turns out that what has been difficult is implementation issues. Basically, not everybody agrees with me. I think we don't yet know how to program, despite the fact that we know vastly better how to program than we did when I started programming 1965. But we have insecure applications. We have, in particular, insecure operating systems. And we have, people talk about how many bugs do you have per 1,000 lines of code, rather than saying, no, it's intolerable that there should be a bug in 1 billion lines of code. No, can't get there yet. And so the question is, why is this true? And it's not clear. My own suspicion is that what I'll call the powers that be, and I have in mind more Google, Microsoft, Apple, etc., than the governments. But I am not sure that companies want their customers to have the degree of security I would like, what I would call a secure system, because they want to have more control over their customers than that. The one case that's very explicit, and there's an open argument, in effect, about it, is, well, wait a moment. You might think that parents might want to be able to record any movie that was coming in, then they'd want to watch it before they let their children see it. But Hollywood says, no, we don't want to let you record this, and we want to charge you a lot every time you get to see it. So there's both things could be called security. The parents are concerned with the security of their kids. Hollywood is concerned with the security of its income. And in general, many things about the computers we use today do not reflect an interest in what the user of the computer would call security. Ever wondered why an app can come on and grab your whole screen? Right? A whole set of standards to resist that. It was called secure workstations when the military got interested in it, but isn't much available in ordinary operating systems. So despite all its problems, cryptography has made absolutely, I think, amazing progress over these nearly 50 years. Mid-1970s, we developed public key cryptography. That one was adopted amazingly quickly. I think the first public key product, a hardware product, comes out in the early 1980s. Then in the early 1980s, we had something else come along, which is called zero-knowledge proofs, sort of questions about how you conclude contracts cryptographically in such a way that one person can't slip away with a copy of the contract, but the other person doesn't get one. In the late 1980s, we get what I think of as the second generation of public key cryptography, which depends on a brings the mathematics of the matter up into the 19th century, whereas Diffie, Hellman, and RSA really pretty much depend on things that are a century or two older than that. Elliptic curves were very important in 19th century mathematics and suddenly reemerged in late 20th century mathematics as very, very valuable cryptographic tool that brought the sizes down by about a factor of 10, so it made everything faster. Late 1990s brought an important change that's both technological and policy. The first time the US adopted a public cryptographic standard. It designed it to be what it thought was secure enough for all non-national security government applications, but not quite strong enough that they couldn't break it if they really hopped up and down very hard. But late 90s, they had given that up. They selected a new system in a big international competition. It's called the Advanced Encryption Standard. It will probably be around indefinitely, and it may well be the most widely used cryptographic system in the world these days. Taken about 20 years, was approved in 2001, and it's taken approximately 20 years to field it. 2005, NSA piled on by approving a whole set of public standards and saying, we'll trust these standards for all levels of classified information. 2008 saw two very big developments. First one is Bitcoin, the first big progress in development of digital currency. Hardly without its problems, but a massive improvement on all of the things that had been tried before. Depends on a technology called blockchain, which makes purely electronic, something that had been done using Merkle trees for the signing of documents, digital signing of documents in the 1990s. And then another miracle came along in 2008. It's called fully homomorphic encryption. That's a great notion and actually now works in amazing cases where I have data I don't want you to see, but I want some computing done on them, and you are able to do it either because you have the resources, or more important, perhaps because you know things that I don't. So I want to give, without sharing the data with you, I want you to be able to compute on the data. So I encrypt the data and I give them to you. And you can't read the data, but you can encrypt on them and you can calculate on them. And you compute on these data for quite a while, and then you send them back to me. And I couldn't have done the computations, but now I can do what you couldn't do, which is decrypt them and get the answer. And amazingly, there was a DARPA project that applied that to what's called the problem of a black conference bridge. You have a conference call, you don't want whatever is the mediating center of the conference call to know any of what was discussed. And so in their particular case, they had iPhone 5s as their secure phones, and they used Amazon Web Services as their conference bridge. So at least some very useful problems can be solved this way. That puts us, it's amazing, you know, cryptography in some sense echoes my whole life. I grew up in a period that was just incredibly exciting because radar was new, TV was new, nuclear power was new, computers were new, biology was exploding, right? And today, I think, you know, I think a young person going into science faces the same amazing situation. And cryptography is echoing the same excitement I felt in the 1970s. So We have homomorphic encryption, a whole new phenomenon we couldn't do before a little over a decade ago. We have quantum key distribution, which is often mistakenly called quantum cryptography. It isn't really cryptography because it's channel dependent, but it is a whole new alternative to using cryptographic systems to distribute keys or using diplomatic pouches to distribute keys. We have blockchains and all of the kinds of cryptocurrencies those give rise to, and no end of possibility in things to be done there. We face a tremendous threat, one which, if the physicists come through with it, will make the cryptographic systems we developed in the 70s and 80s useless. It's because they depend on hidden cycle lengths. When you're doing something like Diffie-Hellman or RSA, the big secret is how long a cycle you're moving around. You can move around it very fast, but if you don't know how big it is, you don't know how far it gets you when you take a big step. But there are under developments new kinds of public key cryptographic systems that will resist quantum computing. They're probably going to be a good deal more expensive and probably require a redoing of a whole lot of security protocols. And finally, we have an ongoing, apparently unending controversy about the use of cryptography. I'm very grateful. I've been making a living off that controversy for a good deal of my career, but governments and police in particular are not happy that people can send messages that they can't understand. And people, businesses, all sorts of public interest groups, human rights groups are very pleased to be able to send messages that businesses can understand. So enjoy this conference. You're getting a window into a wonderful new area of discovery.